I think in our culture today, it seems like there's nothing that we don't think leadership training can accomplish. And we really need to confront that notion if we are to save leadership culture and prepare the next generation of leaders.
Dr. Elias Aboujaoude contends that leaders emerge from an alchemy of unpredictable personal, psychological, and situational factors that are not easily controlled or manipulated. In his latest book, A Leader's Destiny, Why Psychology, Personality, and Character Make All the Difference, Aboujaoude says that organizations that rely on simplistic concepts of leadership fail to recognize that not everyone should or wants to be a leader. Organizations that focus on the inherent psychological characteristics conducive to successful leadership find better leaders and spend less time and money helping them be successful. Dr. Aboujaoude is a clinical professor, researcher, and writer at Stanford University's Department of Psychiatry. He is chief of the Anxiety Disorders section and director of the Impulse Control Disorders Clinic. His work is also focused on mental health issues related to the use of internet-related technologies and the potential for telemedicine to increase access to care and to advance global health. His earlier books include Virtually You, The Dangerous Powers of the E-Personality, and Mental Health in the Digital Age, Grave Dangers, Great Promise. His work has been featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Harvard Business Review, and the Chronicle of Higher Education, and on the BBC, PBS, and CNN. Special thanks to today's guest host, Jane McCracken, Deputy Chief of the Court Services Office at the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts. Jane is also a member of the FJC's Executive Education Advisory Committee. Jane, take it away.
Thank you so much for joining us. It was a really thought-provoking book. It's been staying with me as I think through a lot of things that we do in our office, from leadership and succession planning. My first question to you is, what is wrong with American society's current understanding of leadership?
Thank you, Jane. One big problem with leadership today is that we've turned it into an industry. We've turned it, in fact, into a $50 billion industrial complex. We are selling people the notion that anyone is reasonable raw material for leadership, provided they sign up for the right leadership training course, provided they attend the right leadership bootcamp, or they sign on the right executive coach. And by doing that, we have moved leadership too far away from its roots in psychology, personality, and character. And the goal of my work as a psychiatrist and as the author of this book is to reassert the importance of psychology, personality, and character and how leaders succeed, and their role as essential ingredients that money can't buy.
So of the problems that you've highlighted here, which concern you the most and why?
What concerns me the most is how far away we've pulled the whole discipline from psychology. If you think of leadership, you will think of emotional intelligence, right? These are traits such as self-awareness, social empathy, the ability to take one's psychological temperature, but also the psychological temperature of the room. And these are linked to personality. And if we know anything from our field of psychiatry and mental health, is that personality tends to be stubborn, tends to be sticky, is not malleable, is not the kind of thing that you can change over the course of a TED Talk that you listen to or a business school course that you sign up for. And yet so much marketing now is trying to send us that message that personality, psychology, and character, the subtitle of my book, essentially don't matter. What matters is, again, getting the right help, and you are all but guaranteed this personality transplant that will turn you into a successful leader.
So how can we use science, particularly psychiatry and psychology, to develop or identify current and future leaders?
There's no doubt that traits such as the emotional IQ or EQ traits are essential to emerging and succeeding as a leader. These are scientific facts that no one can or should contest. Where it becomes problematic is the so-called science of being able to teach these traits and instill them in people who are not endowed with them. And this is the kind of science, so-called, that we should really take with a grain of salt and challenge a lot more than we do if we are to rescue leadership from this new sort of definition that has been forced upon us and that we have somehow embraced.
What does science tell us about the potential for leadership?
So science tells us that emotional IQ is absolutely essential to the emergence and the success of leaders. It tells us that being charismatic is also important. It tells us, however, that charisma by itself is not sufficient. You also need to have the right drive. You have to be driven by a desire to help others succeed and not by solely by personal gain or the desire to fulfill what you feel is a God-given right to become a leader. These all have scientific backing, but the problem is that we have convince ourselves that there is a science, a parallel science, that teaches these things reliably and instills them reliably in people who don't have them.
So, in terms of training or educating the next generation, I note that you say that critical thinking and creativity that are promoted through the liberal arts and social science education is missing. Why does this matter?
Something really strange has happened in that the rise of the leadership minor and the leadership major in schools has coincided with the decimation of the liberal arts and the humanities. I think something less than 1 in 10 people will graduate with a liberal arts degree. At the same time, we see this incredible boom in all things leadership studies related, when the best thing that we can do for our leaders is probably look for them in fields like anthropology and sociology and history, because these are very much the disciplines that teach critical thinking, that teach creative solutions to complex problems, that teach the importance of communication, that teach us that life is much more complicated and unpredictable than the black and white certainties of the STEM fields.
And you do mention also that luck plays an important role. So how does serendipity play into leadership, and how does it explain the emergence of unexpected leaders?
Leadership, which likes to think of itself as a science, I think would benefit from looking at the role that serendipity plays in the scientific field. Major discoveries in sciences, from penicillin, which transformed our approach to infectious diseases, to cisplatin, which is one of the most commonly used chemotherapy drugs, owe their discovery to serendipity. And yet, in our current approach to teaching leadership and selling leadership, we want to convince people that if you put in a certain input, then the output, meaning success in leadership, is all but guaranteed. And this myth is really fundamental to being able to sell $50 billion worth of courses. When serendipity and things that happen because you happen to be at the right place at the right time are absolutely essential to the emergence of leaders. I think if you think of Winston Churchill, who's always among the top 3 leaders of all time in survey after survey, his path to becoming the leader that he became is full of twists and turns. When he, in 1940, became prime minister, Neville Chamberlain, was replaced by Churchill. Chamberlain wanted somebody else, Viscount Halifax. The Lords wanted Halifax. The King wanted Halifax. Churchill himself wanted Halifax, and yet Churchill became prime minister and became the mythical leader and the mythical hero that he became. And this is just one of many dramatic examples in the history of leaderships, of leaders who became leaders after taking a very serendipitous route. But this is not how we approach leadership today. This is not all the books that promise 8 tips for, or 9 hacks that, or 10 shortcuts to. They take a very different approach. And we would go back to having a little more humility in our approach to what makes leaders happen. And part of that humility is accepting the role of chance, accepting the role of serendipity.
You note that technology and even social media have made good leadership difficult and maybe even caused poor leaders to emerge.
One personality trait, in some cases personality disorder, that unfortunately is very common among leaders is narcissism or narcissistic personality disorder. Narcissists, it has been shown, are much more likely to apply to leadership positions, and when they apply, they are much more likely to be rewarded with them. So the leadership class is enriched, if you will, with this personality trait and with, in some cases, this personality disorder. I'm not overgeneralizing, but statistically, it is the case. And one of the personality traits that are nurtured and encouraged online is narcissism. And I wrote about that in my book, Virtually You, years ago. And since then, a lot more evidence has accumulated about the role that social media can play in augmenting and disseminating narcissistic traits. So if you look at the definition of narcissistic personality disorder, it includes things like exaggerated self-importance, need for unwarranted admiration, and you can see how, with follower counts online or with the number of likes and the kind of stage that you can get online, how technology and internet-related technologies specifically can really encourage and further enrich this trait among leaders, which is always interesting to observe how leadership is playing out and how the relationship between leader and follower is playing out on social media.
How can current leadership avoid making the mistake of promoting future leaders that have these problems, whether it's narcissism or another unwanted feature?
Part of the problem is that the leadership industrial complex is putting out so much product now that the only way for a leader to stand out is if they happen to be meaner, more narcissistic, louder, more able to saturate our lives with their online and offline presence. And I think part of the solution, and it's a solution to other problems we have beyond narcissism, is to really reduce the role of this industry and go back to the psychological personality and character basics of leadership. And if we were to do that, automatically less narcissists and less sociopathic individuals as well will be likely to rise and succeed in becoming leaders.
You mentioned in the book that the medical community would inform the way we are nurturing future leaders.
I talk in the book about personalized care and the move toward precision medicine, which uses large amounts of data to personalize and individualize the treatment, to see each patient as a unique person with a unique set of challenges and strengths. And I make a distinction between that and the recipe type approach to leadership and leaders, where essentially anyone, regardless of their personality makeup, can become a leader if they follow particular recipes and if they remember certain acronyms, regardless of their differences.
How can an organization act on the ideas in your book? How can we prepare for when the need for leaders arise?
Organizations should shy away from simplistic solutions, from the popular assumption now that a coach can either fix any leader who got in trouble or prepare anyone to become a leader. I think organizations should make more room for serendipity, should pressure their employees less to become leaders. I mean, if you think of all the leadership development opportunities, they're very well-meaning in many ways, but that have unintended consequences, such as making people who are not interested in leadership or who don't succeed as leaders, gives them an inferiority complex, for example. I think organizations should be more aware of that and really move away from this notion of leadership as something that you can definitely control, reliably prepare for, convincingly form, and toward a more sort of spontaneous approach that doesn't pressure people to become leaders if they are not so inclined, and encourages them to do what is more aligned with their personalities. And if they become leaders, fine. If they don't become leaders, then that's fine too.
So, what kind of training or mentoring might be worthwhile to help pull out and identify those leaders?
So when you think of coaching, for example, coaching is one of the legs that the leadership industrial industry rests on. There's nothing wrong with coaching to improve nonverbal cues or posture or body language. There's nothing wrong with coaching that helps give business advice or that gives a leader or a would-be leader a sounding board. But when you start thinking of coaching as something that can impart EQ or as something that's psychotherapy in disguise, when most coaches don't have any background in psychology or psychotherapy, that's when it becomes problematic. So recognizing what leadership training can and cannot do. And I think in our culture today, it seems like there's nothing that we don't think leadership training can accomplish. And we really need to confront that notion if we are to save leadership culture and prepare the next generation of leaders.
You cite an article that says that coaching intervention can boost critical leadership competencies by 20 or 30%. Can coaching be used effectively, and how?
If we go to the roots of coaching, of business coaching in the 80s and 90s, it was very much focused on business advice, practical help from folks who have a background themselves in corporate or other organizational culture. We have moved very far from that notion and have turned coaches into psychologists, essentially. And there are many reasons for that. If you think of how men who still dominate the leadership class, how historically they have been very resistant to psychological interventions or psychotherapy, or, and have kind of been raised and socialized to take a grin and bear it approach, this has helped make coaching the industry that it has become, because it has felt like doing therapy without calling it that. And coaching is a very normalized thing for many guys because of its roots in sports. So it has helped turn coaching into pseudo therapy, which is very problematic in business culture and, in my case, in clinical culture as well. I mean, I see patients all the time for whom I recommend psychotherapy, and the answer often is, but I'm seeing a life coach. Well, what are the credentials of your life coach? And the life coach most of the time is not someone who has had any training in mental health or psychotherapy. And we have something like that taking place in corporate culture and in leadership culture, where psychology is hugely important, but psychology is now being handled by well-meaning coaches who don't have the necessary training to really understand how psychology can help or get in the way of leaders' success. And we really need to take a very critical look at the role of coaching and leadership culture today because of this.
In the book, you talk about managing down. What does it mean to manage down?
What I talk about in the book, again, in the context of this focus on narcissism and leaders who are forever interested in whatever next promotion they can get, whoever is above them in the hierarchy that they need to please or replace, and are always focused on that person instead of actually leading. And by leading, I mean focusing on followers and those who are below them on this hierarchy, who they are supposed to be lifting. So the need to manage down, as I define it, is really the need to lead and stop obsessing at your continuous rise and start actually leading.
What does that entail? Do you mean leaders being more self-aware, or what can they do?
So self-aware is definitely part of it. And as far as this particular issue goes, being aware of how they're interacting with whoever is above them, but also with the followers, also with the people that they are supposed to lead. And if they notice that they're paying much more attention to the president because they happen to be a CEO who wants to become president, and really not nearly enough attention to the employees that they're starting to lead, then that's the red flag. That's a leader who's not leading. That's a leader who's not interested in lifting others and who is in it for himself or herself.
The public sector, it's not profit driven, and the bureaucracy that we may work in is not necessarily rewarding of attention seeking behavior. So are there particular lessons that we can apply from your book to leadership in government?
Part of me wishes I could fully agree with you, Jade, on this point. I think a lot of the dynamics and the psychological issues that I've identified in the book, I was able to also identify in the nonprofit sector, in government, certainly in academia. Academia, I think, has been a great sort of microcosm for a lot of the problems that I talk about in the book. So I see us as globally embracing this unhelpful model of leadership across really all sectors, including those that you might think or you might want to be sort of immune to some of these issues. So I think collectively, we need to go back to the psychological, to the personality, to the characterological basics and roots of leadership, and away from this business that we have turned it into and the pseudoscience that we have turned it into.
What more would you like leaders in our branch, the judicial branch, to know?
Thinking about it, I haven't talked nearly enough about the judicial branch in my book. I would say that maybe more so than any other branches, the rise of the wrong leader in the judiciary can have magnified negative consequences. The rise of someone who is a hard narcissist or someone who has sociopathic traits. You can see how the downstream effects of that could potentially be a lot more harmful than somebody like that rising in, the corporate sector. So I think even more awareness and even more attunement to some of the issues that we talked about, to really making sure whoever rises and whoever is rewarded with leadership, that they have the right psychological mix and the right characterological underpinnings to really deserve that spot.
You mention in the book some tools like the wedge of awareness tool that might be helpful, even though a lot of the acronyms and tools may not be. Do you have some recommendations for tools that you find useful, or alternatively, that we should be cautious of?
Yes, I mean, you will find pearls of wisdom in some of the leadership training material, and I have personally adopted a couple of them. There's one called FIAO, FIAO, which encourages leaders to identify facts, inferences, assumptions, opinions in what they say or in data that they encounter. So I don't mean to paint every single acronym and every single tool with the same broad brushstroke. But at the same time, I would invite folks to really be more critical than they are, but that doesn't mean that you won't find something like the wedge of awareness that can really come in handy and help improve their functioning a leader.
You've talked about going back to the basics with identifying leaders. Can you explain a little bit more what you mean about going back to the basics?
I'll give you an example. So there's something called the leadership potential indicator, which is a very commonly used tool that is supposed to help identify leaders and those with leadership potential. If you go online, you'll also find tools that help you ace the leadership potential indicator test. So if you're someone who's applying for a leadership potential, who's expecting their prospective employer to have them take the leadership potential indicator test, you can learn how you can ace that test and how you can come across as someone who's very emotionally intelligent and psychologically attuned. So rather than simple answers, I like to go back to the essence, which is to allow folks to do what they are naturally inclined to do based on their personal psychology. Don't pressure them. Don't make them feel like losers if they're not interested in leading. Don't make them couple self-worth with leadership positions. Don't make them feel any less if they don't succeed or aren't interested in leading. So these are the basics that I think we as a culture should focus on rather than highly problematic and fallible tools, I think.
Where can we learn more about your work and about this topic generally?
So if I may, I'd like to refer folks to my book, A Leader's Destiny, Why Psychology, Personality, and Character Make All the Difference. There are many resources that I link to in the book and on my website, www.eliasaboujaoude.com.
Dr. Elias Aboujaoude, I thank you for your time with us today.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Thanks, Jane, and thank you for listening. For more episodes, visit the podcast link at fjc.dcn/EE. You can also listen and subscribe to the podcast via Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. Episodes are also available on fjc.gov. In Session, Leading the Judiciary is produced by Shelley Easter. Our program is supported by Lori Murphy, Angela Long, Jamie Mitchell, and the entire studio and live production team. This podcast was produced at U.S. taxpayer expense. Until next time, thanks for listening.